we are all happy to watch the presentations on that. And then after a coffee break, the second half will deal with new data modalities. That could be genetic data, that could be other data forms. We will hear a lot about also digital endpoints. So very interested in that. And then we will close the day with a panel discussion and then the assembly. So again, a warm welcome for today, and I hand over to Marissa.
Thank you, Uli. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I hope. This is Marisa Bacchi. I am working for J&J in the Quantitative Science Consulting Group, and I'm very excited to be here with you and to learn about new data modalities and federated learning. And before welcoming the speakers, I wanted to give you my, let's say, 2 cents on why I believe federated learning is becoming more and more important in our field. Bearing in mind that we have been working for the industry, many of us, and we have generated high quality data compliant with the regulatory requirements for a long, long time. So why do we need more than that? We need more than that because I think we are kind of witnessing an evolution of the data evidence generation. In a sense that, as you remember again, coming from this data, we have also started to need broader spectrum of data. And it started quite some years ago with the idea, especially in rare diseases, to get real world data, for instance. And real world data is in rare disease, pediatric populations, has become now more or less a standard. Regulatory agencies have released guidance and guidelines on how to use this data in the context of new drug approval and post-marketing commitments. So we have seen this evolution of moving more and more into broader spectrum of data, more type of data. And there has been a parallel evolution of the privacy requirements, which means that to make use of intelligent use of evidence generated, let's say, by broader sources, we have sort of learned to manage this data, and we have to learn, and we are learning. And again, I am very happy that the speakers can tell us what is the ongoing learning in this. We need to learn to cope with data which are more and more private. They have been collected for reasons which are not necessarily the same reasons or answering the same questions that we are interested in the industry too. And therefore, we are growing into generating reliable evidence from broader and broader sources. That's kind of my 2 cents. We are here to contribute to that sort of path to enlightenment, to get more data, more meaningful data out of different sources without violating privacy and confidentiality requirements, which may be different side by side. So don't want to spend much more time into my rambling. Happy to talk about this more in the coffee break and in additional interactions. And let me have the next speaker maybe to introduce himself. Alexandros, are you online?
I'm here.
You are here. I don't know him. Yeah. Good, excellent. We'll show you on the phone. And you see, I needed the glasses to get
Seems to be the right one.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, thank you very much, Marisa. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be here. In this first brief session, we'll do an introduction to federated learning. We'll explain what it is, some of the key concepts behind it, what are the benefits, some of the challenges as well. Of course, that it has, we'll see some of the obvious use cases that we see in different industries, some of the future glimpses in our domain mostly, and then hopefully then also a snapshot of the evolution and the growth in its adoption in our domain. So without any further ado, very often people are talking about this being a futuristic capability, something that we need to consider for the mid or the long term. I tend to see it as actually something that's very critical to adopt even today. The reason for that is that we're seeing other industries, like for example, big tech, where it also originated in its current guise called federated learning from Google some 6-7 years ago. It has been industrially applied at industrial scale easily since 5 to close to 6 years now. So some of the applications when we're using big tech gadgets, for example, when you use your face in order to log in or do certain transactions, when you use your voice in order to interact with Siri, these are things that are happening because they're very convenient, they give the right user experience, hyper-personalization sometimes. But of course, there's a big concern behind all of that. What will happen if my data goes into the wrong hands? So companies like Google, like Meta, have been using this technology in order to be able to provide this security to the end users. But although they're using this very critical information, they can still protect it by keeping it local and proprietary, as we'll see further down. So it's all about using this capability in that industry in order to give hyper-personalization, to give the relevant content at the right time, but at the same time also being able to protect the very sensitive information. Another domain that this has not been so much talked about, and another type of application, is the go-to-market, supporting go-to-market, supporting business models, supporting pricing, by being able to combine data that sits typically with the commercial department of organizations together with very sensitive data that sits within the confines of the finance department. The data in the finance department is something that you don't want anybody to see. Typically, even in the realm of a single organization, they are not keen at all that this data is being transferred or shown to others, because obviously the risk of losing some information outside the organization can have very bad results, brand reputation, and the likes. So what I've been seeing in the financial service industry since 3 to 4 years, insurances, but also have observed over the last year in our domain, companies are taking together these types of data without seeing the data sitting in the finance department, trying to do dynamic pricing, targeted pricing, ultimately trying to secure affordability from the target customers, but also optimizing the efforts required for them in order to go successfully to the market. One might think this is very opportunistic, but at the same time, I think it's not a bad thing. If your affordability is something that you're trying to support with that for the target users, plus at the same time, the go-to-market campaigns become more efficient, meaning the resources you normally use to do endless cycles of go-to-market can be used for more valuable activities. So again, a very strong use case for federated learning. And one more industry that federated learning has been poised to be very impactful has been the mobility space. The cars and the vehicles are becoming ever more connected, ever more smart. But obviously the downside to that is you have a humongous amount of data that potentially can drown the networks, the data networks, the mobile networks, and so on. So the industry had to look for solutions like federated learning in order to push the analytics as much on the edge, often on the vehicle itself, sometimes at the very edge of the mobile network. So with the likes of Cisco and similar players, avoiding in the process to have to drown the network, as I said, with millions and millions of data points from millions and millions of users and vehicles. But at the same time, the same concerns remain here. You want the information to give this hyper-personalization, to give you the right content in the infotainment system, to give you the right guidance with the GPS, let's say. But you don't necessarily want everybody to know about what are you doing. So if we think about predictive maintenance that you can enable by monitoring very well a car, this is a great benefit. But if you're having the bad habits while you're driving your vehicle, this can also be used hypothetically against you from the insurance. Because if you're driving in the wrong way, the fees might go up in order to preview for the users you're doing the heavier usage of your vehicle. So how do you address these contradicting challenges? Federated learning. So again, a very good domain where this has been getting applied and also to great benefit, I think, both from the sustainability of the network and the whole setup we have for data and AI applications, at the same time, again, safeguarding the privacy and the interest of the individuals. So how does this work? This is a very high-level explanation. If you see on the left is the typical way how normally someone would do analytics application. You would have the different data sources, the data silos, as we call them here. You would transfer the data to a centralized domain. You would homogenize potentially, and then you would run the analysis. If we look on the right side, with federated learning, it's quite a different approach. You leave the data in the different sources, in the silos, as we call them here. And what you do, you take from the centralized domain an untrained or sometimes even a trained model. If it would be a trained model, we would call it federated analytics. To keep things simple today, we say it's an untrained model and we call it federated learning. So basically, you take this model, you deploy it in the different sources, you train it in this source individually, and then out of each source, you take a trained model and you bring it back to the aggregated server. This is a process that you might have to do multiple times, depending on the quality you are targeting to achieve in your model, depending on the quality of the data you have in the different silos, depending on the variety of the data. There is a wide range of parameters that will require ultimately how many iterations you need to do before you would get the result you desire in terms of the quality. If you do a double click of this process to make it a little bit more graphical, if you go from the left to the right, we look at the straight line. This straight line, let's assume, is the machine learning model, the untrained one. So when you deploy into the different silos on the left, it always looks the same because it's the same untrained model. As we pivot to the local execution, to the middle of the screen, we see that the algorithm starts to become personalized. Let's say it reacts to the data you give it to at the different silos. And then if we pivot on the right side, on the aggregation level, we see that the different individually trained models, the different angles we see in the different lines come together, and they get aggregated, they get averaged, for example, and then you start getting your global model. And this is the process that happens, as I said, a few times until you reach the quality you want, and you end up having this global model that will be good enough to be deployed at all the different sites. What are the benefits of that? A big benefit, as we see on the left, is that you ensure the data privacy. So everyone who owns the data from the different data silos can remain the owners, and nobody sees the data, nobody copies the data, nobody transfers the data. So that's a very important aspect in many use cases. Also, having this local execution can bring a lot of benefits because you don't have to transfer the data. But also what's very beautiful about it, which is not obvious to people when they consider federated learning or not, is that actually you wouldn't have access to this data if you wouldn't use federated learning. So a whole host of new opportunities open up in terms of developing new analytic applications, new understandings of what you can do with different types of data. And this is difficult to quantify in advance before you do the experience in terms of the value you can create. And then also very important on the right side, we say collaboration between different stakeholders, including diverse regulatory environments. There are environments that the data cannot live where they are no matter what you want to do. Take China, take Russia in some instances. But we have had instances of clients that they wanted, for example, to enter these markets, but the know-how, the scientific know-how of their assets and the products was sitting in the Northeast in the US. So how do you do that? That was the only way you could use Chinese located data, know-how and scientific analysis that's in the US, still be able to bring the product into China with this approach. To make things a little bit more complicated, here are the different types of federated learning. From the left, let's say the most simple, if one may say so, in the middle gets a little bit more complex, and to the right, the most complex version that one can handle. On the left, it's horizontal federated learning, although bizarrely, it seems it's accepted in the industry that is depicted vertically, the horizontal. It's a situation where all the data you need to run the analysis for every subject, they're sitting in the same database. So if you have 3 types of data that you need for running your algorithm, for every subject, you will find them in the same database. So for subject A, they will be in one location, for subject B in another location, and the likes. And when it's a little bit more complicated, the data for one algorithm, for one subject, would be distributed in different data sources. And this is the vertical federated learning, which is in the middle, depicted horizontally. And then if we look at the most complex case, which is on the right, is when you take the know-how and something you have developed for a specific use case, and then you need to do a pivot, intellectual or data science pivot. Take that know-how, take these machine learning models and the way you went about developing them, and trying to replicate this knowledge into a similar use case. So this is definitely the one that requires the biggest capability. Just to make it very graphical in a super simplified example, let's say you're trying to calculate cardiovascular risk disease for a number of people. Let's say here, Bob and Alice. For both of them, you have the same values you're using, the age and the cholesterol value. So for Alice, you find all their corresponding data in one database. Similarly for Bob, for another, and ultimately you can run the analysis. When it starts getting a little bit more complicated is when the data for a single person, let's say Bob in that case, they would not be sitting in a single database, but they would be in different. So maybe there is in a cloud database the age, and maybe on a device the cholesterol level. So there, in order to run the algorithm just for the single subject, you would still have to go and run the algorithm in parallel in different locations, which increases the level of complexity from a data science point of view. And maybe not only sometimes. And here's again this simple description. Another example of Bob and Alice. Here you have developed this machine learning model for cardiovascular disease prediction, which you have applied for a population, including, for example, Alice. But then using the same value, so a similar, let's say, use case, age and cholesterol in this simplified example, you're trying to calculate not cardiovascular risk disease, but diabetes risk. So in that case, you take the know-how from one population group, which would include Alice, And then you extrapolate this knowledge and these machine learning models, and you try to apply to a different population group, which would include, in that case, people like Bob, and try to run a similar analysis and try to come to a similarly acceptable quality of result for a different condition. I hinted strongly that there are benefits with federated learning. Privacy was called out a few times. If we do a little bit of a deep dive on this one, there are two dimensions. There is the aspect of the algorithms, which is more on the left side of the screen, and then there is the side of the data themselves, which is more on the right side of the screen. So on the left side, we see that normally you put the algorithms in this centralized environment. It could well be that you don't need to do anything specific on that or anything special on that, especially if the data and the algorithm owners is a single algorithm owner, or if there is no specific IP that someone tries to protect. And it's quite common for us when we do such implementations not to have anything special on this left side happening. But if you have multiple IP owners when it comes to the algorithms utilized or people who don't want to disclose the know-how in a collaboration environment, it could well be that you need also on the left side for the untrained model or even the trained model to apply things like secure multi-party computation or homomorphic encryption. When it comes to the data access in the different silos, it could be that you access directly the data at the original location, but could also well be that the data owners don't feel comfortable with that, so they would prefer to have additional protection on them. The most common thing we have seen based on our experience would be to apply a secure enclave, as we call it here, or confidential computing. So basically, you extract only part of the data there from the broader data set. That's the one that you are tapping into in order to do the analysis. Then, in other cases, it could be that you also need to do anonymization or pseudo-anonymization, also quite common as an extra measure in order to be sure that the data cannot be, let's say, deciphered. But what we have seen, we're talking about rare disease, as Marisa was saying, when it could be that actually, even if you run this process, because the population sample is so small, you could still actually understand what has been happening in the background. It's not uncommon that you might have to apply differential privacy, combined maybe with homomorphic encryption, because applying these two things, it means even if it's a very small population sample you're targeting, it's very difficult to understand why and what happened exactly and who was behind the result you got. So the good news is that there are many options, and these are the additional things you can do in order to give the absolute, let's say, comfort to the participants and setup that you are protecting the privacy at all costs. The second thing is cost. Actually, this is the number one reason why when we're doing implementation in the industry, we're capturing originally the attention of our partners. There are three main buckets we're calling out here for the cost. On the left side, we say with the same infrastructure, even if you will have different implementations with different algorithms, the centralized capability can be reused to a large extent. So that's very effective. Not every time you have to rebuild the infrastructure from scratch. Of course, on the node side, the more you have sites participating, the more nodes you will have. So this is a different part of the equation where the costs increase with the increased complexity of the different sites. But what is very, very nice is the pipeline costs. If you would imagine you would tap into multiple data sources that are keeping producing data all the time, you can imagine having tens or hundreds or thousands of data sources producing data all the time. So you end up having to produce big highways of very traffic data, which is very expensive to produce, very expensive to maintain. And if you also want to take it a further step in thinking, it can also be environmentally not friendly. And here with this approach, instead of building these big highways of big traffic, you just have a small little path where you deploy the algorithms back and forth. And then the no duplication of data. By taking such an approach, it means you can reduce to a large extent the duplication of the data. You don't need to keep data in multiple databases at the same time. And this not only is a cost saver in itself, but also it's a cost saver because you don't have to always try to moderate that, to govern that, to understand where is the latest version. If an error happened, where was the error originating from which of these parallel databases, and so on. So quite a complex process in the industrial setups. And to close this deep dive on the benefits, linking also to the privacy, the first one, the responsible AI, it's a topic that's becoming ever more important, I think, for the regulators. It's becoming even more important, I foresee, in the future for the people participating in anything to do in the health domain and sharing their data. So it's very reassuring to know that actually the control of the data access is remaining always with the data custodians, which I think is a very important aspect. And also similarly, by sharing metadata and not the raw data, you can still ensure traceability and auditability, which is very important for transparency and accountability, big pillars of responsible AI. Here we list a list of use cases we are seeing in our domain. We have classified them as conceptual, mostly academic, mostly research level, or industrial deployment level. To be honest with you, we have seen them all actually in the industry happening. But the reason we split them into different levels of maturity is how many of them are we seeing among these different use cases. For me, the key takeout of this slide is that if you look at these use cases, they're not small experimental use cases or niche applications that someone might want to, let's say, do in his spare time. We're looking about clinical trial, patient recruitment, we're looking at personalized treatments, drug discovery, pretty much at the core of the value generation in life science in the health domain. Which means the key message here is that actually this capability is to be leveraged in order to extract value at the major opportunities we have in our industry. And I think that's the most important message. That's why I also said at the beginning, I think today is the time that people need to consider federated learning because it's not a nice to have, but can be disruptive at the core of the value creation. Similar here on this slide, we're trying just to create a narrative. What are the good things that you can create thanks to federated learning or enable? Collaborative, obviously, research for the reasons I explained. Different parts can come together. You can maintain the competitive advantage, which is very important for many people when it comes to new things and innovative things. Diverse research exploration, as we said, by being able to access new types of data that normally you would not be able to access. You create new opportunities. So diverse research exploration and things that normally you wouldn't even think are possible if you wouldn't have this capability to access new types of data or more diverse types of data or more high volume or high quality types of data. But still, the single most important for me here from this list of 5 messages is the bridging the interdisciplinary gap. No organization, no matter how big they are, how rich they are, how successful they are, they can bring at a timely and cost-effective manner all these capabilities that you need today in order to be successful in data and AI. From the data volume, from the data variety, the tech capabilities, the data science capabilities, the market access. It's a very complex environment in order to execute efficiently and effectively. And I think that's the biggest opportunity from federated learning that can accelerate the bringing the piece of the puzzle together and allow people to play without having to build everything required on their own merit, which is very, very difficult and very expensive and very time-consuming. We talked about many good things. Are there any negatives? Definitely. In a dream world, if you forget the costs, if you forget how realistic it is to bring everything together, still having data centralized allows you to do in a very effective way data analysis. So if you have to purely compare what is the challenge around algorithmic and models, what about the technical infrastructure, especially when things scale up, or also the privacy evaluation challenges? Yes, we said you can apply many measures, but every time you take an extra measure, that also means you make it a little bit probably more complicated from the data science point of view. So you must always be very careful. What is the target? What is really required in terms of privacy and security to apply, in order also to make sure you do not compromise the speed or the quality of what you're trying to achieve with the federated learning approach. So still quite a few skills that need to be mastered. But if we take a step back and we compare the benefits and the drawbacks of these type of drawbacks versus the drawbacks if you don't have this in your armory, I still think the equation looks dramatically better towards saying, yes, you should consider federated learning when it makes sense. Here, talking about challenges, we just felt it might be a good idea also to call out some of the main players. So as you will see from the different buckets of challenges, different players we believe sign the most. If your biggest challenge is around algorithmic and models, I think Flare and NVIDIA are still the number one. That's at least our view as Accenture, closely followed by Microsoft. When it comes to technical infrastructure, it's no surprise that Microsoft and Intel would be the most performing ones in our view based on the service catalog. And when it comes to privacy and security, we believe the best would be still the Python. The message from here is it's not like, okay, so nobody's offering the perfect solution. I think the good message here is that you need to be mindful, where do you foresee to be the biggest challenge, or what do you foresee to be the key capability to really have the best you can in order to deliver the value in a cost-effective and time-efficient manner. So I think this is very good to know that the different players are strong in the different areas, and you still have options to select with whom to play. Plus, also, if you have the right infrastructure set up, it doesn't mean that if you work with one tech stack, you are excluded from being able to leverage also the others. And as the last slide, you will see strangely we talk about 2006. At the beginning, I was saying that this exists in 6-7 years under its current guise. If you talk to people from data and AI, they will tell you, well, these principles existed since the 80s or 90s at the worst case. So yes, distributed computation, distributed analytics have been around for a long time. Now it's called federated learning, bringing also all the latest and greatest we have in our armory from the different providers. But the important thing here, the key message is we see that things keep exploding in terms of adoption. I think it's going to become dramatically more so. Because of the complexity, because of what Marisa said before, the data sources are getting more and more varied. Personalized healthcare is becoming more and more required. from a cost efficiency as well perspective. So we need to be able to accommodate two different things. A lot more different data, a lot more different disciplines. And at the same time, we need to be more cost effective and more timely efficient. So this is why I think federated learning is a key capability that sits right at the correct location in order to be able to bring these two challenges more close together. And with that, well, thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you very much. I'll stay here. I think we have a couple of minutes for immediate, urgent, hot reactions from the people in the audience. Yes, we have done a very good job in summarizing all these complex concepts in a very short time. So let's take advantage of some questions from the audience, if any.
Yeah. Thanks, Alexandros, for this great presentation. I've just, on the technical side, a little bit of question, how restrictive it is to do federated learning from a methodological point of view?
I think it really depends on the setup you're dealing with. It depends if you will have, let's say, all the bad things coming together, like different data standards, then the deviation distribution of the data in every data set being different. So if you get a perfect storm that all the big challenges are coming together, I think you might get challenged, and especially if the project has an implementation at big scale. So I think there might be situations that the limits might be tested. But again, to my experience, I haven't seen all of that perfect storm coming together, but at the same time, it cannot be excluded either. So there could be instances that's going to prove to be more expensive maybe than the traditional way because of such a perfect storm coming together.
And myself, just my 2 cents, it's wise to try to do some feasibility assessment
Absolutely.
before embarking, I would say, in these exercises, understand the data that we have, we don't have.
Fully agree. So this is a beauty, and I think, again, I fully agree with you, Marisa. We should always recommend that, but at the same time, the beauty of this approach is that you don't have to go and build a data palace, I would call it. It's a very agile infrastructure. You can deploy it in a comparatively agile manner. And it allows you also to validate assumptions that otherwise you have to spend years to try to collect all this data on your own, which might even be impossible, but maybe you would wait years before you can validate an assumption. While now we can validate an assumption within months. And I think that's a big, big benefit that it's difficult also to make tangible when you're doing the analysis upfront.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Ooh, Emmanuel.
Just a question. Thank you. Very good presentation. Are you aware of how health authorities are investing or exploring the field as well to work among themselves and maybe also to work with industry or with academia?
Yes, I mean, what we're seeing is a big evolution both on private and public sector in adopting federated learning. I think one good example in the public space and health authorities has been the NHS in the UK. So in order to be able to improve the way you do diagnosis across a very scattered and very fragmented landscape that they have, we decided, I think, a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, to rely on federated learning in order to be able to tap into all the data for similar conditions across the country without having to go through centralization first. So I think authorities do understand it. And also what is encouraging, I think, is that the regulators are also looking at this very closely. Like the FDA is working proactively with the industry in order to establish the new standards, in order to be able also to give comfort to the participants that nothing undue will happen. So I think these two things give a good indication that, and just two small examples, that the industry understands this is needed and they're taking the right measures both from the health authorities but also from the regulators to be able to accommodate that.
Thank you very much. We had Mark booked first and then Lila.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. One question on, I think you called it the vertical federated learning, whereas the same patient has data in different databases, right? For bringing this together, you need to have some kind of a link, right? Like a patient identifier.
Absolutely.
Which has to be the same, I guess, but at the same time, you don't want to be able to trace back to the patient. Can you say something about how this works?
Great question. So definitely you need to be able to identify them. So identity resolution becomes part of the puzzle in such vertical federated learning. This was why I said the level of complexity increases. What you can do after you have done the connection of the patient, so you identify the same subject, what you can do after is you can apply certain algorithms in order to be able to basically distort completely the data. So nobody can go backwards and calculate what was the identity of that person. So first you identify and connect them, but after you apply certain processes on top that make sure the information becomes impossible to crack backwards for third parties.
You said something about local. You said local data, but you didn't say so versus what other option there is. And I guess I'm thinking about sustainability, right? Because you also mentioned, also Marisa, we're scaling up on these databases. So where are they located? How to protect ourselves from that kind of sustainability question, and how is this problem typically treated in the solutions that customers are asking for without
creating
saying
something
too
unsustainable.
much?
Yes, yes. No, I think it goes exactly in this direction because you allow the data to remain where they are now, right? They could be on a device, they could be on a cloud database, they could be on an on-premise database, so you don't change the current setup. And also you do not create this huge traffic of huge volumes of data because at the end of the day, you only deploy the algorithm back and forth. So one algorithm versus maybe millions or tens of thousands of data. So when it comes to sustainability and environmental impact, definitely federated learning is the right way to go because you minimize the impact in that sense.
Manuel?
If I may have another one. Following up from Mark, is there work then on the validation and then replication of the research and of the learning and in general, reproducibility of research? How is that approached in the federated learning?
Can you make it more precise just to make sure I understood the question correctly?
Well, on the most basic side of things, I guess in our usual interactions with regulators, for example, when you submit data and analysis, they need to be able to replicate it. Whenever you learn something that you want to ascertain, you need to be able to replicate the learning, the experiment. And then in general, we saw an issue in research that some learnings are not easy to replicate, and I would expect they are very hard to replicate here because your data moves, your data sources may move, and then as you say, you cut links as you learn. So you never can replicate what you've done, basically.
So what I can say, and again, maybe I'm not sure I will answer precisely the question, I'll try. Typically with this approach, you are able to access more diverse and more varied data sets. So also not being confined to the, let's say, data source of one hospital, but multiple hospitals, which also means that the variety, the ethnic groups, just to give an example, are more broad than otherwise. So typically this is a good indicator that this can be more highly likely to be replicated versus the alternative way. And again, hopefully this goes in this direction, but happy to follow up on this question for more specifics.
There is a question from online. Do we know if data protection agencies like ICO have guidances on use of federated learning?
Yes, I mean, not all the agencies, but as I was saying, the FDA, for example, has been working since 3 or 4 years now together with the industry to produce those guidelines. And other agencies are also following. So different levels of maturity.
Not yet.
So yeah, FDA, for example, does have, but not every agency.
Thank you, Lila. We have another question from the audience here.
I had a question regarding the data quality across the different sources of data. I mean, if you have like 2 hospitals with a different EHR system, it may become really difficult to combine those data. Are there ways to assure the data quality locally, or how do you do that?
So you have to vet the quality of the data at the beginning of the process. And this is what I said before, the range of the data or the quality of the data can vary, and this is something that you will have to evaluate at the beginning of the process, at the first iteration of the algorithms. And as also Uli asked before, can this be a breaking issue? If all of these things end up to be on the challenging end of the spectrum, then definitely it can be that you reach also the breaking point of such an approach. So definitely this is one of the challenges you have to accommodate as you go.
Yeah. Very, very, again, it's a growing. We are building on kind of science and algorithms and theory being developed as we speak. So really, thank you very much. And maybe in a couple of years we come back and we see where we are from there.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Alexander.
You will stop eventually.
A check in a second.
Yeah, that's what the people online are missing. The virtual attendees is
No problem.
So let me introduce Anastasia. Thank you for being here with us. And Anastasia, she's a PhD student at the very famous APFL.
EPFL, yeah.
Yeah, in Lausanne.
Yep.
Yeah. And she's in the Laboratory of Optimization and Machine Learning with Professor Yagi. That's kind of all great to hear. And your research is focusing on distributed optimization, in fact, on machine learning and federated learning. And you were even the recipient, I don't know if the current still a recipient of this Google PhD sort of support award in machine learning. So great to hear and learn from you now.
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction. And yeah, today I want to, like previous speaker, covered very well, like federated learning and some algorithms and like some challenges. And here I want to talk like in more detail about algorithms, like methodologies, and like from research point of view, and like opportunities as well. Let me like recap a bit motivation of federated learning. You heard it as well. And yeah, in many applications in machine learning, data comes from distributed sources. Like for example, if you want to learn some language model, the data that you want to learn from is like some text, and people type this text on mobile devices, on laptops. So these are distributed sources of text data. Or like for example, like second example, like closer to topic of this meeting is medical data, where data originates at different hospitals. So it's data like some real data of patients, some imaging, some history, like medical history, and so this data originates distributedly over like many hospitals. And in classical approach, how would we train? Like if we want to train some machine learning model, how would we do it? We would take all this data and move it to a data center, like to some like one place, and we would train like a model in this data center. And this is not like sometimes it's possible, but it's not always desirable because of privacy constraints. If this data is private, you don't want it to share, or like it might be even protected by laws. So it might be not possible to implement the solution. And in federated learning, it's a way how can we still train machine learning models in such like under such constraints. Is like so in federated learning we want to collaboratively learn from such data without moving it outside of like organizations that possess this data. So what like it would stay local. And so this brings us to mathematical formulation of federated learning. So we have here, like, I will call hospitals as clients. And so every client has its own local data, DI. And so we, based on this data, we like construct this empirical risk, so like our loss function, so which is average of all local, so this is average of all basically losses of our model over all the local data points, xi. So here x represents the model that we want to learn. So these are like parameters of machine learning model. And in federated learning, what we want to do is we want to collaboratively among all these clients to solve one common machine learning task based on private local data among all these clients. And our objective is to minimize the function, which is average of all local loss functions on all the clients. And yeah, so I'm going to highlight again what X here is machine learning model that we want to learn. So it's like I use this notation. And one of the most popular algorithms to do it is to use federated averaging. It was introduced in 2016 and 17 by people at Google. And how this algorithm works, so we have a central server that coordinates the learning process. So it chooses some initial model x0. So it chooses like architecture and like learning schedule. It initializes it. And when it sends this model to clients, when clients locally update this model using local data. And so we can do it for several steps. And so we have this x1. So these are updated models. So we are different on different clients because local data are different. And we send this updated model back to central server. which aggregates it and moves to the next step. And this is just one iteration. Yeah, and so central server. So this is just one iteration, and this procedure continues for many, many iterations. Usually, you need to do quite a lot of iterations to converge. And this algorithm is very popular, and it has like a number of challenges. So first is communication efficiency. If we want to learn some big model, like especially big model, and because we need to do a lot of rounds, and every round involves communication. This communication step is slow, could be slow, because you need to transfer all these, like all the model parameters from all the clients to the server and back. And it can slow down your training process quite a lot. And so this is one challenge. Second challenge is data heterogeneity. Because different clients have different data, it usually slows down the training process. And how to overcome it, how to converge faster. So that's also a challenge. And like final challenge is privacy. Although this federated averaging already has data locality property, it's not enough to protect privacy, because especially if you train a large model, it can just memorize training data. And even if you don't have access to the data itself, but you have access to the final model, in some cases, you can recover original data. And so that's a problem, and there need to be like more protections for privacy or like for original data. And I will start with the first communication problem. So as I said, communication is slow, especially because we need to do a lot of rounds until convergence. And so there are several ways how can we overcome and how can we speed up this federated averaging algorithm. So one of them is to use communication compression. So instead of sending the full model, so here on this slide, I represent the model as a matrix. So it's like matrix of parameters. So it's just like a representation for this picture. And like one idea is, instead of sending the full model, like all the parameters of a model, we would compress it and send only a compressed version of this model. For example, we can select, like for every coordinate, we would select only a sign of this coordinate, and we would send only like this 1-bit representation, if it's like a plus or minus sign. And it would like already be like 32 times, or like depends, yeah. So it would be like much smaller bits you need to transfer. You can also do sign plus norm, or you can select the top like coordinates by magnitude and send only them. And here is the challenge is if you do it naively, if you don't correct for any errors, it slows down your conversions. And so there are some algorithms, I'm not going to explain you here, but there are some algorithms how can you do this communication compression and still efficiently like converge with a fast speed, so that you don't need to do too many rounds. Second solution is to use decentralized communication. So this classical federated averaging has a centralized communication paradigm, where we have a central server, and it communicates with all the clients. And if you look at the center, it has to communicate a lot with everyone. And one idea how can we speed it up is to use decentralized communication. And so it would mean that we have no central server, and all the clients communicate over some communication graph. And if this graph is sparse, we improve communication efficiency on this center. And so it could be also like more robust in case like if center fails, the full algorithm fails, and then decentralized, it can still work. So that's like another solution. And yeah, so there is like in all these possible solutions, there is a huge amount of work and a lot of algorithms that can do it. Yeah, so this is just overview. And the solution number 3 is to communicate less frequently, is to use local update steps. And this is what federated averaging algorithm is doing already. So you don't need to communicate at every iteration, like after every local update. You can do locally a lot of updates on every machine before you communicate next time. So that's And this is this finishes with first challenge about communication. So second, what I wanted to talk about is data heterogeneity problem. And if local data are different, and especially if we do a lot of local steps to save on communication, so it can, like local models can drift quite a lot from initial model, and it like on the averaging step, it will hurt your conversions. So here you see like a picture where every error represents every local steps what you do, and you see what on client 1 we have like one data distribution, so what it always goes on top, like all the local updates move here on top, and like on client 3, like we have different data distribution, and it moves the local model to different way, and so this poses like a problem in communication or in conversion speed. And so there are so one of the possible solutions how to do it is you could estimate this drift that every client takes. So you do it by previous iterations. So you estimate, okay, my model number 1, so my client number 1 always goes on top. And you estimate it, and you try after every local step, you try to correct for it and to move it to the right direction. So you know what client number 1 always goes on top. So after every local steps, you add negative direction of its drift. And this is so there are, it's like a general scheme, and there are a lot of algorithms that try to estimate this drift, and they work pretty well in some cases. So this is solution number 1. And another solution is it's more like a subfield. Is maybe, so in all these previous examples, we wanted to learn one global model. And maybe actually this is not what you want to do, because if your data are very different, so maybe it's like some different populations, or maybe you have some like different imaging devices that have different models from different years. So they have completely different images that you produce. So maybe you want specialized model for all the clients, but when the challenge, so you could do it just without collaboration, but if you collaborate, you can hopefully you get more data, more diverse data, and you hopefully get more accurate models. And so how to learn personalized model and still benefit from our data, how to understand who is useful for you and who is not useful for you. So that's a challenge. So there are some algorithms, but it's still quite an active area of research and still open question. And so this is about data heterogeneity. And the last topic that I wanted to cover is privacy. And as I said before, the main motivation of federated learning is because we have private data, we cannot move it to the center. So we have to use federated learning. And if we apply federated averaging algorithm in naive way, even individual model updates, in some cases, you can recover original data. For example, if you have a linear model, your gradient would be proportional to original data, so you just get the data out of a gradient. And if you have a large model, it memorizes your input data. And one way how to deal with it is to use differential privacy. So differential privacy is a formal way to ensure, mathematically ensure that you have some provable privacy guarantees. And so a definition. So here I give intuition of definition of differential privacy. So differential privacy, so if we have some algorithm f, so f of d is some algorithm that gives you output on d is the input data. If we have two data sets d and d prime that are close to each other but differ only in one data point, so when if the output distributions of this of your function f are close to each other, you cannot distinguish if you use the dataset D or dataset D prime. So you cannot distinguish if there was this data point, if one particular data point was in your training data or if it was not in your training data. Okay, I hope it's clear. Basically, if you like, so function f is like some random function out of your data, and if like the distributions are close enough, you cannot distinguish if some particular data point was in your training data or if it was not in your training data. And how can we add the differential privacy to federated averaging? So the algorithm is quite simple. And so it starts very similar like to federated averaging itself. So we initialize some model x0, send it to all the clients. Clients update it locally. And then after updating, we cannot send it back because it would reveal some data. And we have to privatize these updates. So we take this magnitude of update, x1 minus x0, we clip it just to ensure that there is no outlier that influences your update too much. And then we add some privacy Gaussian noise with some magnitude alpha. And alpha here is related to privacy. The more noise you add, the more privacy you get, right? And but you like will hurt your model in the end. And then so this is now privatized update that have formal privacy guarantees. So you send it back to the central server, and it aggregates it just in a very similar way as before, and sends back like the next model. And here, so we have to add some noise, and the more noise we add, the more privacy we have. But the problem is, if we add too much noise, it will hurt your final performance. It's just Gaussian noise that destroys information. And a challenge and the big question is how can we design some better noise structures? Maybe not Gaussian, but some more clever noise that will improve privacy, but not destroy final performance. And so with this, I covered these 3 topics. And actually what we want is not just all of them separate, but all of them together. And all of these components are quite easy to combine, even all like in communication efficiency, for example. I covered 3 possible ways. And it's just possible to combine all of them for like even more efficiency. It's like not separate. So it's actually like all together. And so this is not not the full list of challenges. It's just some examples. So previous speaker gave us even more challenges, and so like some of them is system heterogeneity. So if we have different capabilities on different clients, some of them have more GPUs, some of them has less, some of them have more data. How can we efficiently use all of them? Another one is like malicious participants. So if some clients are malicious and send us some garbage updates, how can we ensure what our performance is not ruined? And like the final one is how to incentivize the clients to give you good data. Maybe like in medicine, I'm not sure if it's applies. But like for example, if you are a driving car company and you have like a lot of data that is crucial to your business, maybe you can just send some low quality data but still benefit from the final model. And you have not much incentive to send actually good quality data, and how to incentivize all the people to give you good quality data. That's in our challenge. Yeah. Thank you. That's end of my presentation.
Thanks a lot, Anastasia. We still have some buffer for this presentation as well for local questions. Wow. Careful here. Starting from the front row.
Thank you. No, very fascinating presentation. I have a question regarding the speed of communication.
Yeah.
I think the second solution where you showed like decentralized. Yeah. I ended up counting more arrows in the decentralized version than in the centralized. So I was wondering, like, how, maybe you can tell us more, how is this helping in terms of speed?
Yeah, thanks, yeah. Yeah, so, like, you have more errors, but you can process them in parallel. And here, because you have a lot of errors at the same node, which is center, you sometimes maybe cannot process them in parallel. It depends on the capabilities of your center, right? But the center has, like high degree. So basically, the speed is determined by highest degree, because if these two, like this one and this one, they have no connection and they can be in parallel. Like, they have no common node, and they can have, they can be implemented in parallel. So we don't have to wait for each other to finish. Yeah. So it's more like about speed versus the total number of communicated messages. Yeah.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a great presentation. Maybe something that I'm a bit puzzled about. Let's say you have a bunch of data which is completely like homogeneous, it's perfect, and then you have a like polynomial, fairly complex model on that, and then you start splitting the data, decentralizing that, and trying to fit model locally, which can be any kind of model. And then you say you average them together, and in order to replicate that polynomial, let's say, and then if you split it again, you basically come up with different bunch of other models that you can't necessarily aggregate and get the same data, because you basically lose information by locally trying to fit a model. It can be completely off, and each time that you split, you lose information in a different way. How you simply aggregate and average them to get the, maybe the final thing, it might work on a very simple things. If you have a, let's say, classification, yes, no, something, you can go for this voting. But if you have a bit of more complexity, it's hard for me to imagine you can aggregate those models.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So, this what you are asking is exactly about this data heterogeneity problem, as I understood, right? Because you have different data, and if you do like a lot of steps locally, it might be hard to combine them, right?
Well, even if it's homogeneous, if you randomly split your data, you might basically, you create heterogeneity because you're working in a smaller portion, let's say.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, so in classical federated averaging, so that's kind of a problem, exactly, and that's why it converges slower. And you either do like so if you do just one local step, it will be same as centralized computing, right? Because so okay, how to explain this? Yeah, so like if you had all your data centrally, right? What you would do, you would sample some batch of this data, do like one step, gradient step, and then you sample it again, right? And if you do just one step locally on all these clients, they would not drift much, and it would be very close to your centralized model. Okay, I hope it's clear. We can discuss it. We can talk about it afterwards. Yeah, and so and when if you do more steps, then you get this problem that you have different data, and like if you do like a lot of steps, you just converge to the local solution, right? Local minima, and this local minima is very hard to combine. And in federated averaging, you just need to take small step size, so that you don't drift too much. So that these are quite small. So and when there are like all these correction for drifts, where you estimate this global direction, and you try to not deviate too much from what you would do centrally, basically. You estimate what central would do, and you try to be close to the central direction. So, yeah, we can discuss it more if it's unclear, yeah.
I have Marcel here and another two or three questions if we have time.
Thank you very much, very interesting. I have a question I think is related to NIMAS. So if I'm still thinking I have all the data at my hands, right? And I get an estimate, and let's say that's kind of my truth. So if I now federate, when do I get to this truth and when doesn't this work? Are there like settings where you just cannot work with federation? Or how does this?
Yeah, so in principle, you can always work with federation, just because if you do one local step, it is very close to centralized. But it's going to be very slow because you have to communicate like a lot of time, and it will slow down like by much your conversions. That's why no one does that. And usually federated averaging and overall federated learning hurts your performance, right? And it hurts your accuracy. But frequently it goes pretty close to centralized. But you have a lot of parameters, and you have to play with them, and you have to fine tune. and you have to. It's very case by case specific. I'm not sure if I can answer this question.
Yeah, but in the sense, when we assume that the truth is in a central place and not elsewhere, we have that kind of duality. When we kind of relax that, in my opinion, I'm just expressing my own opinion, totally not an expert view. When you assume that the truth is not exactly in one place, but it's in many places, then the trade-off of obtaining the right estimation of the truth is becoming more challenging. So yeah, it's true that industry collects very good quality data to answer specific questions. So we come, most of us, I was planning to make a survey how many of us come from the industry and with a statistics background in the room, but we can do it later. Then we assume we have the truth and we have an answer to the question. Now there might be many more truth and more questions to get from out there that we have not necessarily yet collected and we are aware of.
No.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know whether it works in that case, right?
Yeah,
I totally agree.
Yeah,
This
I
is
guess it's
much
more
broader.
like a question to Alexandros, because I am really like I'm more like working on algorithm sides and he knows applications, and maybe he can answer this question. But
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, and we have a couple of questions. There was one question in the back. Thank you.
Yes, I had a question, but it's more like a practical one. I don't know. I can ask. All right.
I can try to answer.
So my question was like, on the practical level, I understand that you train models on different data sets, but imagine I'm a clinical center and I have a very specific population. So can I get some specific models, right, from this network that are based on the proximity of my population to the other? So is it only like the averaging of the models, or is also some other data that is given to you, like, I don't know, population description, etc. Not only the output, as a model from the others, but also kind of a high overview of what data they were using. But I don't know if it's too practical.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly, what is currently implemented. I think in principle it's possible to know like some more statistics, not just final data, like output, right? And you might not always, there is like this personalized federated learning where like everyone learns their own model. So you don't have actually a global model, right? And in principle, there is like a lot of different like things you can do in federated way. Right, it does not have to be just a final model. Yeah, I think.
Thank you, Anastasia. We have one from. Sorry we need to allow for some people remotely to ask their questions. I'm looking forward for the others to hold your questions for the panel, maybe.
It's a question on differential privacy. If it can be, let's say the noise introduced can be client-based, because some clients might require more privacy, whereas it's not an issue for others. Can that be kind of targeted?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Yeah. So if different clients have different privacy constraints, you would add a different noise magnitude. At this step, like if some clients have less privacy constraints, you add less noise. If they want more privacy, yeah. So that's possible. Yeah, that's totally. Yeah.
And another is, how does correction for the drift affect the local model performance? How do we somehow regulate that by correction so that we don't lose the knowledge that's already gained?
Very good question. I don't remember. I remember we wrote like some graphs about local model performance. I think, so if I remember correctly, if you want a good model, like local model performance, maybe you don't need to correct for the drift, and federated averaging works well already. So this is like what I remember from like maybe a year ago. Yeah.
There are a couple of other questions, but they're very technical. Maybe, I don't know, do we have another couple of minutes?
Yeah, I think if they are
Maybe
very
we leave it
technical,
for-
we may
for the
need
panel.
to have a bit of closing down before to allow Dominic to take the stage. I had myself, I'm biased, I am sharing it, so I'm asking a question, more a question, a comment. Ages ago, there was one big database of MS patients that were, this database was, let's say, academic database, and they went that far as, with the privacy concern, to remove the year the clinical trial was run. Now in MS, there is a stage migration process, unfortunately. So the moment you take out the year the studies were run, you're losing so much valuable information. So the excess of privacy, let's say not so meaningful in my view, privacy concern was applied at the root, at the source, and that was removed from access. So imagine making sense. So the meaning of the privacy versus the meaning of what we are doing, what we are asking, is still, I think, up in the air by disease area, by, let's say, compound, by question we are asking. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Like a case study that I wanted to share.
Yeah. So the idea is what maybe like the model can, if we have a lot of data, the model can learn some general patterns of this data without learning individual data. But how to achieve it is a question. Yeah.
Yeah, if you remove something due to privacy concern that is so meaningful that then kind of takes out the meaning of your data or a lot of the meaning of your data, then you have a problem. But with these techniques where you are allowing federated learning, you don't, I think, need to do these drastic maneuvers, pulling the data in one source and then removing the year.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So I find federated learning is an approach which allows not to have that sort of drastic removal of meaning of information. So it's a solution, I'm trying to say, potentially. Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And next on is Dominique. Dominique is a senior director in the data science department in Roche, and he's leading a team of data scientists that are working on both machine learnings and federated learnings in standard type of endpoints, in innovative biomarkers and digital endpoints. Obviously, as we all do, kind of with the aim of obtaining meaningful developments for the patients out there. Thank you,
Thanks,
Dominique.
Marisa, for the invitation. And let me start to really congratulate on a couple of great questions. I think you can ask exactly the same questions also after my talk. Some points will be addressed, but I think it's really a great question, showing the whole field is really in progress. And after Alexander's presented a little bit a high-level overview, then we had Anastasia going really into a little bit more kind of like also the technical sides. I tried to complete a little bit the session by giving you really some experience from a recent implementation on a federated network. Just about speaking the same language. I think on figure 1, you really see what we have heard. That's the centralized approach. So basically, you harmonize data, you bring it together, harmonize it, then do the analysis. And we have heard really, because of many privacy laws, it's quite hard to achieve. Then what we see currently out there, a lot of so-called federated networks actually using meta-analysis. So basically you harmonize data, but then you, at the end, you basically do a simple meta-analysis. So there's many publications calling this also aggregated networks. So that's true, but that's important to also see the difference when I then later talk about really federated analytics. And as you know, with meta-analysis, you normally have some limitations. Once you do this, really you take the aggregates on the sites and then basically meta-analyze them, that you really end up with ecological fallacies or aggregation bias. So basically meaning you basically combine data without taking into account kind of like the underlying causality, and this could lead to wrong assumptions. Federated analysis, there's also different terms out there. We heard from Anastasia nicely talking about federated learning. My talk is more about federated analytics, so the application of statistical models to basically data you have at the hospital level, and then you basically federate it. So my talk is structured into two parts. First, I want to introduce this data and biosample network. So I will explain what we do, why we do, and how we do. And then in the second part, I go a little bit deeper into the building blocks on this federated network, highlight a little bit of recent observations we also had by building up this network. So what we are doing, we really want to scale collaborations in a novel way to actually achieve two things, more data and more innovation. The more data part is really coming, the more and more we see hesitation also because of regulations to combine data, to get really to a diversity of data, because sometimes you cannot move data out of the countries. There's other regulations applying. So federation can really help to bring data at scale together, not only in terms of sample size, but also kind of like the quality on the patient basically journey data. So you really collect more also multimodal data on the patients. So that's one of the aim of our network. The other one is really more innovations. And you will see then in the how, why that's important, but it's basically what we observe. Traditional collaborations really is with a few centers. You have high trust, similar-minded people, and you have a little bit of cognitive lockdown in terms of ideas. And when you really broaden that and you really treat everybody as a partner, you can really break this cognitive lockdown and really create innovation at scales, because you really combine much more people working on similar data to do analysis. And below the graph really shows a little bit kind of like the setup, and you've seen in previous presentations a lot of very similar approaches. So you have the centers, they host the data, you have an interface to an orchestrator where you do all the computations, and then basically out of that I will talk a little bit about the use cases. So that's the what we are doing. Why we do it, it's probably very obvious. Also, Alexandros has spoken a couple of the use cases. So the value proposition is really twofold. One for the patients, for the society, where we look, for example, for the patients, by having really a lot of data, but high quality data, multimodal data on the patient, you can really enable precision medicine for the patient, helping to treat the patient with the right drug at the right time point. This also for the science, of course, you can develop new targets, you can develop new biomarkers, you can also develop novel endpoints. As an example, we are currently working on voice biomarkers really to detect or to replace traditionally used endpoints for multiple sclerosis. And once you have this network, it's much easier, because I will talk later on, you leverage the local infrastructure in almost real time. So you can actually very nicely deploy digital endpoints and so on the site level, leverage their data collection infrastructure, and then basically use the federated network to really combine the data across the sites. And that's really a powerful value proposition of federated learning analytics. And of course, the society. I mean, we have treatments then on the market, and then basically to demonstrate really, they really provide a huge benefit to the society. You can really address with federated learning also societal kind of questions such as adherence and others. What's the value proposition for Roche? It's very much aligned what we want for patients, for society. It's also great for the company. So there's really a higher synergy that we want to basically improve discovery. I mentioned it before, new biomarkers, new targets. We want development, accelerate development by introducing novel endpoints, feasibility studies where you can quickly really access data on a site level to assess, for example, do certain sites have the right data to join such a federation approach. And then finally also shaping medical practice, where you can have precision medicine, which helps really to treat patients better, but also, for example, for developing, as I mentioned before, clinical decision support tools directly on the site level, given you have actually the whole infrastructure set up. So ultimately, we want to enable with more data, with better quality data, also the next generation evidence-based medicine. So after the what and the why, it's the how. We really started a journey. We started with building trust. That's important. Also, we've heard there's so many measures you can take to kind of preserve the privacy. However, all starts really with trust, also coming to Anastasia's point, make sure people really want to contribute and they contribute high quality data. So you start really with one-to-one collaborations and then scale this slowly up. Currently, we are in phase 2 where we have nucleus sites, so we have 3 to 5 centers with different kind of use cases basically ongoing with including also external partners who help to develop that. So in that case, Roche is some sort like the orchestrator, not for the computation. So for that we use basically, and I will go into this kind of like a closed system, but you need initially to have a driver to really build up this network. That's the nucleus sites, where we currently have 3 use cases ongoing, where we have different configurations we test. But ultimately, where we want to go, it's really this network where we have all equal partners. So think about you have 10, 20 hospitals, university medical centers, all connected. Everybody can actually run computations. You have a consortium which drives the scientific kind of like direction on the analysis, but basically every site can execute the analysis in a privacy preserving way. And I think that's where we want to go. And this will really allow generating insight at scale much faster. So after having introduced this data and biosample network, let's go now a little bit into the core building blocks. So it's similar to the slide or the concept I showed before. On the left side, you see the data. So really, that's one important part, the data. Then basically the connections to the orchestrator, that's the second important part, the orchestrator itself, and then basically the insight generation for, I mentioned here, medical practice for research. So the key building blocks is data, IT infrastructure, and data science, statistics. And I will go basically into the 3 of these building blocks. Data, what we have observed so far. A challenge to work with hospitals is really that they have a suboptimal data pipeline there. They have a lot of great data, but sometimes what we observe with different hospitals, you have different data sets harboring different elements of patient data. So what you really need when you build such a network, you really need to closely collaborate with those, and that's substantial efforts needed, both technical, financially, to really help to build up a data pipeline which is fit for purpose for such a federated effort. Then the data model, and I think we are in the building phase, and one of the big learning was really, you build your research questions because they will also change over time once you have such a network in place. So what data model to use? In particular, once you combine real-world data with clinical trial data. So that's a big challenge which you develop as you go. And we figured out that's kind of like very challenging because a lot of the times, and I will come to that also in the statistics consideration, you don't know the data yet, which you then analyze, the structure and so on. And this makes it hard because you need to prepare all these algorithms. They are not really, many of them off shelf. And this really means this challenge that you learn the data, learn which functions you need to use, and then basically develop those functions, and that all in a reasonable time. And I think this is really in the scaling phase, one of the big challenges. Once in 3-4 years, I predict much more will be available and the whole paradigm will change. But currently, that's one of the key challenge on the data perspective from the sites. And the third one is, we heard the questions before, this real-time data catalog. That's also something you build on the go, but basically in the future state where we are in, where we have this 10, 20 hospitals connected, we have basically real-time insights into the metadata, what data is available on the site and in what quality. And I want to reference back to a very nice BBS webinar in March this year, where this whole data quality about real-world data in federated networks was actually discussed. And for those interested, can go back. I provided the link on the slides. And this gives you really an idea that that's really the parts you need to co-develop together with your partners. And this makes kind of like the data part of the 3 building blocks complete. Then IT. And we heard a lot from the previous people about the IT challenges. What you actually want to achieve is that you empower collaborators, that you incentivize them to share basically sensitive data, but at the same time, they have full control on the data. And a couple of key characteristics, key considerations really that you need to think about: who gets access to what data is available, who can access that. You need to track who does what analysis at what time point. So you really need full transparency on your entire system, access data, analyze data, and also share then the results of those analyses. There is a lot also about that you need to ensure mechanisms to actually detect disclosive output. So a lot is built in the statistical function. It can be an add-on, and I will talk to this a little bit on the later slide as well. But that's one of the key aspects that you really ensure, simulate, test the entire environment with respect to this element. And then, of course, you have things like, once you access the system, basically that once I have a bad intention, I would get into the system, that within the system, I don't have technically access to everything at the same time. So this comes back to elements like the network segmentation, network communication. Do you need encryption? What type of encryption do you go as far as encrypt the results? So you do computations on encryption. That's all considerations you need to think upfront when you build such an IT infrastructure to really ensure it's private, it's secure, and you have full governance on the data elements and the processing on the data. Second building block. Now we go to the third one, the statistics part. And something we heard from the previous speakers, really, it's evolving. When you look at the number of publications just the last 1, 2, 3 years, it's evolving. It's evolving. It's a diversity of new approaches, how you ensure privacy by using those technologies. And one challenge is also, I will go into a concrete example to really show what you can do to deal a little bit with this diversity of tools. So I introduced kind of like 4 approaches we are currently looking into. One was created 2015, it's called WebDisco. It's for horizontal learning, so basically you have different patients at different sites with the same features. It's an R-based implementation, it's an iterative estimation, so it's what we heard before from Anastasia, it's a lot of communication costs are substantial in this approach. So what you do, and this comes back to a little bit, as I think somebody asked before the question, can you do basically federation? Should they shield always basically the same results than doing the central analysis? And the core idea there is really you generate a separable loss function, so you can optimize locally, share back, and then basically you get identical results in theory. So basically with WebDisco, what they use is really a special representation on the likelihood. So you get actually the separable loss, so you can do basically local optimization. You share back the gradient, the Bayesian, and then you reconstruct globally the model parameter, which you then share back to another couple of iterations, go back until you achieve certain convergence criteria. So it's a very iterative but communication-heavy approach. Then Andrew in around 2020 and team developed basically an improvement of that because they observed the communication costs, which can be with federation quite substantial. Even simple computations normally takes a few minutes. So it's really substantially different than if you run a local analysis, and as such, optimization of the communication cost or minimization thereof are important. So basically what they propose is a discretization on the Cox model. So you change basically the Cox model into a classification problem. So what you do is basically you take all the observed time and bin it. So you change technically the rate, the hazard rate, into a conditional probability. And as such, actually, you need much less communications than what we've seen before with WebDisco. And it also has a couple of other features. I think we haven't yet fully looked into that, but it also allows you to easier specify a nonlinear relationship with your mean function. And that's quite nice when you think about applications of neural networks and so on. Then a very different approach, how you can think about privacy is basically you do a projection on the data. And in 2008, you presented actually for, again, horizontally partitioned data, a non-iterative basically iteration. And this was only done at that time for prediction, so it doesn't help you with estimation on your initial target model. But the core idea is you share a projection matrix across all the sites, then you protect project the data to a lower dimensional space. And this lower dimensional space you share back. And I think this was also a question before. There are tools where you share more back than the model, and in this case, it's actually the data, or the transformed data. Dimensionally reduced data. And given that once you reduce the dimension, in most cases, you cannot really basically recompute it back. And this is considered kind of like an element of privacy. So this was 2008. So you share the same matrix, project, and share back the projected data. Then basically a very recent implementation we are also currently looking into is called the DC-COG. So this was published in 2023. And there the approach is slightly different, and it also actually nicely applies to horizontal learning. So it's again a non-iterative process, so communication costs are much more efficient than what we have seen before. So what you do here, it's kind of like interesting. Instead of sharing this matrix B we have seen before, you share actually an anchor data. So you share anchor data centrally to all the sites, and then they apply a local individualized projection to the anchor data and the real data. And then they share those two projections back to the central orchestrator. And then basically what you do there is actually you solve an optimization problem to actually take all this local data with the help that you have the anchor data. So out of that, you can guess basically a specific matrix that you can have all the data somehow like combinable. And then you do your COGS model on this combinable data centrally and send it back to the sites. And with that, you can actually, or at least the publication demonstrate that you can almost get identical results than if you do basically the central analysis. But we are still working, so that's all work in progress, and I will share shortly also some results about that. But you see really these different ways you can basically transform data, share this back, you can share only the algorithm in an iterative way, and Anastasia nicely outlined, you have these different dimensions you need to think carefully about when you select the right approach, which may be suitable for your specific computation. As also Anastasia and Alexandros mentioned, there's basically also the way that you can combine all these tools, right? One is to preserve privacy within the statistical functions. You can also add, as we have seen, differential privacy. You add noise. You can think about basically using even synthetic data, AI-generated synthetic data on the local nodes. So you can really combine it with everything which is currently also in development. Homomorphic encryption with together with affiliates, we have some use cases in this space where you basically, you don't trust the orchestrator. So what you do is you encrypt your results and you compute based on the encrypted results. And again, it shows actually kind of like interesting results that you get actually pretty close to when you do this without encryption, but it comes definitely with some challenges. So what's the conclusion out of that? You have some functions, but often it's really top-notch research that it hasn't been holistically assessed. So what you need really when you build such federated networks, you need a holistic, basically testing validation environment. And that's currently our setup is really that we use basically two approaches. First, we start when we collaborate, let's say we have 5 hospitals with the Roche node, we create out of the Roche node virtual nodes, and then we basically test those functions on those nodes. And if we can show really you get highly similar results to central computations. As you see on this process flow, you have pooled data, you partition, you do federations, and you should show that these federated results are highly similar to basically when you apply the methods on your central data. And once you have figured out your approach is sound, valid, you go in a second step really to enclose basically the side nodes, because there can always be also additional observation about the communication time, because suddenly the communication time depends on basically the nodes, the implementations you have on the side, the whole data pipeline, all the elements needs to be tested as well. So that's kind of like important to really think also strategically. You have a lot of functions, how you test them to make them really fit for purpose for your specific application. So that's just some work in progress. So we have run this now across kind of like virtual nodes. And you can see a little bit, that's two ways how you can present basically this data. You can think about really correlation plots. This was using the DC Cox implementation with where we generated some heterogeneity in the site data. So the data generating process differed slightly, and also the covariate distribution. There was a very simplistic model with 3 covariates. On the x-axis, you see the central results. On the y-axis, you see the federated results. And ideally, it should be the dashed line that they are identical. And what we see currently, the line is not too far away from basically the dashed line, but you see a lot of variation also in that. So this really shows kind of like there are tools to fine-tune this DC Cox. When you think about the projection methods, there are really different approaches how you can fine-tune that. So that's all work in progress. But also blend-Altman plots is just another way to actually do an assessment about the association of basically a measure or 2 measures which measures basically the same quantity. And as you see here, the plot is not really ideal yet. You see, you have a deviation actually from what you would expect there. You plot basically the difference in your measures against the mean, the average, and you should actually get a very straight line, and this helps really to detect systemic bias. And we are now like in the process to really working through this implementation, how there are elements how you can improve upon our current results. But all of that really shows that we are dealing really with recently published methods, and you really need a holistic, basically validation approach in place. So the last thing I wanted to share with you, there was also something very interesting. I mentioned before, you develop a little bit, kind of like all the elements are the same. The data on the sites, you learn, more data comes in. If we think about multimodal data, additional data models, can you fit the new data into the current framework? One consideration, at the same time, you define the analysis. And something we observe is really, you're working on a core data model, at the same time you work on the analysis, and you know most of the algorithms you plan to use for your analysis are not yet basically there. And then that brings you a little bit of challenges that you think about. What pre-processing of the data you do locally versus what pre-processing you do basically on a central in the orchestrator. Ideally, you would do, for example, missing data imputations. Ideally, everybody would agree we should do it centrally, but many algorithms are not yet there. So there's this trade-off that you say, you have certain capacities to develop the algorithms. The other one is also a little bit pragmatism, so that you think about what pre-processing you do on the side versus what you do centrally. And of course, everybody would agree if you impute data on a local level, that's far from being optimal. But that's all things you need to think about when you define your analysis plan in this go of scaling of such basically a network. So that was a kind of like a interesting observation we had in the team, and this also poses kind of like the team into some challenges that you really need to think carefully how much pre-processing you do. So create analysis-ready data sets versus what you deal all with the orchestrator in the federated analysis. And to summarize, I think it's probably you've seen a little bit in this concrete example, it's that we are in the process to scale this network to multiple hospitals. It's a big learning exercise, so the implementations really is, let's say, a very interesting space, but also a challenging one because all really evolves hand in hand. And what you also see is from a methodological perspective, there's many gaps. And I just listed 2-3 examples. Imputation approaches are not yet really at scale available. Causal inference is an interesting topic. We also work with marginal structural models. So there are new questions that comes up a little bit with challenging federation. Hierarchical models, of course. Also, I think there are just a few papers coming out now. So it evolves, but definitely it's still not there where we would like to have it, that it's really tools you have basically off the shelf. And then essential for the focus, it's first of all really the collaboration, hospitals and the companies or whoever joins the network, that also everybody has really commitment to resources to really build this data pipelines, because at the end of the day, all depends on the data to really make federation working. What we also learned, and that's also kind of like what is exemplified by my co-authors on this presentation with Björn Tackenberg and Eric Bernard also sitting in the audience here, that you really need a cross-functional team. So Eric is from IT, Björn is clinical scientist, myself a data scientist. So really, you need these cross-functional teams to really build up such networks. And finally, I think it's the interesting aspect working really in federation is you need to think very broad about privacy at the same time than statistical rigor, about many, many other elements. And this makes the space really super interesting. And I invite all of you to take this opportunity to co-create a little bit federation for the future, because we heard from all the previous speakers, from Marisa, a lot is to do, but I think it harbors really a lot of potential. And I'm very confident if we do this seminar in 4 years, it will be, oh yeah, I knew. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dominic. I think with the coffee break looming on us, we may want to save the questions for the panel. You will be part of the panel, so we want, people, please note down your questions. But in the meantime, thank you to Dominic and all the speakers. Great session to start with, and then let's talk maybe at the coffee as well. Thank you. Yes, back. In the agenda is 15 past. We have half an hour, so yeah. Also for our remote attendees to get a stretch and the coffee. Thank you.